My name is Sally DeMarco, and this is a presentation on learner-centered approach to learning with a focus on self-determination theory through multimedia instructional design. We will begin with learner-centered approaches. Some key principles include teaching based on a student learning rate and style. In a study by Suwanto et al., the researchers noted that motivation and higher order thinking skills improve in all students participating in the student-centered model, and both genders experience increased motivation in the student-centered model. Heinzman shares that students find the interactive nature of a course to be engaging and enjoyable. In a study by Toe and Tessier, the researchers found that students using a mobile learning application had improved academic performance and higher engagement levels than those in traditional learner settings. In a study by Reina, they showed that students in the experimental group who engaged with digital media assignments scored an average of 15% higher on the post-test than the control group who completed traditional assignments. Qualitative feedback showed that many students in the experimental group found the digital format more engaging and easier to understand. Gianni and Zakin created a predictive machine model to track individual students, proactively assisting them with the students' learning motivation and academic performance in multimedia courses. The learner-centered approach is how the instruction is framed for the learner, while the instructional design is how the information is delivered. This brings us to multimedia instructional design. In a comprehensive literature analysis, Second and Teskin found that the most popular multimedia principles are signaling, modality, redundancy, coherence, and segmenting. In their systematic review, Notel et al. Also added contiguity to the list. At this point, I would like to take a brief pause on the presentation of my research paper and go into more detail about the key principles of multimedia instructional design. First, signaling is using cues to direct attention. Some examples could be pointing at a portion of the graphic or screen, highlighting, changing text color, arrows, circles, sound effects, or even music to signal the beginning and end of a presentation. As we go look closely at these principles, I would also like to show some components to a lesson my students are doing today. In this Desmos activity, the students are allowed to reset the graph. The arrow is signaling to the student where to look on the screen to find the reset button. Next, modality. The modality principle considers audio and visual as two different cognitive channels. Rather than concentrating on the on-screen text, there is minimal text, so the learner can look at the graphic while receiving an audio description. Throughout this presentation, there have been bulleted lists to help minimize the on-screen text. However, in some instances, the learner may benefit from both on-screen text with an audio description. This is called the redundancy principle. If only some of the text is both on-screen and spoken, this is a partial redundancy. It may be helpful for learners that are receiving a presentation in their non-native language, or a learner receiving information with unfamiliar vocabulary, or someone that is hard of hearing. When considering coherence, get rid of unnecessary clutter that distracts the learner because they are busy trying to process non-essential information. In the case of my students' lesson today, there is very little clutter in the form of unnecessary pictures or words. It helps keep things simple for the students. With segmenting, we are organizing and sequencing content into appropriate smaller parts to make it easier for the learner to understand and attempt to avoid unnecessary confusion. In this presentation, I started with an overall visual outline and we have been working through each of the main parts in correspondence with my research paper. In my students' lesson for today, you can see overall there are several slides. However, the students only see one slide at a time and click the next button when they are ready to move on. Finally, the contiguity principle involves placing text next to the graphic. This helps the learner not waste limited processing capacity by searching for which part of the graphic corresponds to which words. In the activity my students are working on, some of the questions read, change one number in the row below to fix the marble slide. These instructions are in close proximity to the equation, so the students do not have to remember the instructions while trying to find the equation. Okay, let's go back to our research paper presentation. Curriculum materials are examples of multimedia and technology in education. Foster et al. Developed a contemporary math curriculum to create clear, concise materials that avoided unnecessary repetition, particularly to aid students learning English as an additional language. While keeping their design simple, the authors recognized that incorporating additional explanations was sometimes necessary for clarity. They also use clear subheadings and strategic use of color in their materials, ensuring accessibility and minimizing cognitive overload while integrating worked examples and fostering independent thought and reflective tasks. In this portion of the presentation, I would like to take some time to further look at the article by Foster et al. I feel like as a high school math teacher, this article about a team creating math curricula based on Myers' principles of design really helped show the application in a way that was engaging to me. First, the article contains a nice model of multimedia learning, showing words and pictures as they are gained by the senses of sight and sound, then organized into words and images through the working memory into the eventual long-term memory with the integration of prior knowledge. When the authors were researching and creating their math text, they found it very challenging to balance the redundancy principle with clarity. In this example, the researchers went with the longer version, but I really think it was worth it. It reads, the mean of a set of data is the total of all the values divided by how many values there are in the data set. If the data are numbers, there will always be a mean. In everyday life, the mean is sometimes just called the average. But in mathematics, the median and the mode are also different kinds of average. There are also other kinds of average which we won't study in this unit. Most math textbooks do not describe it this well, but the risk of the lengthy version helps the students have a better understanding of the vocabulary. With the coherence principle in mind, the researchers attempt to use precise, relatable definitions and include images for clarity. This one reads, the word fraction means breaking apart, like a bone fracture. A fraction is a number that's broken up into equal parts. And down below, we see an image of a barn owl. Some students may have never seen an owl, so this helps add clarification on why an owl could rotate its head so far. Additionally, the researchers paid careful consideration in when to include historical information, ensuring that the information is enriching rather than distracting. In this case, it reads that the Mesopotamians were the first people to invent the wheel. They loved the number 60 and passed on their base 60 numerical system to the ancient Egyptians, who used it to divide a circle into 360 degrees. And then they proceed to show an image that I find this information to be very engaging, and I think students would like it too. I've heard students tell me that other math teachers will often just say, when they ask a question, it's just because it is that way, rather than actual investigate the historical reasons. So I think students would appreciate this bit of history. And furthermore, they're actually learning something in a math class that is not just a math skill, so they may enjoy sharing this information later on with their family. The researchers use named characters that continue to reappear throughout the text, so the students, in a sense, get to know them. The reasoning for this is for personalization and making the characters relatable. Here I will scroll through a few examples. I appreciate the math aspect that there are multiple ways to get to the same answer. So instead of asking the students to apply the skill, they are asked to reflect on multiple methods to ensure connections with the concepts. Spatial contiguity in math texts showed up a couple of times in my research and is really interesting. Here's a great example where we do not have to go searching for the chart. It's just right in line with the text rather than off to the side. Here's another example of spatial contiguity in describing the quarter turn and the same angle and a visual on how the size does not affect the rotation. Here's an example with colors and arrows to explain a process. This diagram shows that spatial contiguity can also be used in a mathematical method explanation. This example highlights the use of color to signal which diagram the questions are referring to. Here they show a guided example using colors for signaling and spatial contiguity throughout the example. I hope you also enjoy looking at this article and seeing how the principles that we learned in class could be applied to a math textbook. Wolcott et al. Found that students and teachers judge diagrams within the math text to be better than diagrams in the margins, which aligns with the spatial contiguity principle. In an eye tracking study, the researchers found that the mean dwell time was significantly higher for diagrams placed in the text rather than the margin, and attracted 3 times as much attention. Supplementary course materials also increase engagement and academic performance. A study by Ross et al. Found that students who engaged with multimodal assignments significantly increased engagement and understanding of the material compared to those who received traditional assignments. Qualitative data revealed that students appreciated the variety and creativity in multimodal tasks, citing increased motivation and interest in the subject matter. Ramson found that students taught through multimedia showed much more significant improvements in English language proficiency than in traditional formats, mostly in listening and speaking skills. Huber et al. Found that multimedia resources can facilitate deeper learning between subjects. So far, we've looked at the learner-centered approach to framing instruction for the learner, and multimedia instructional design to illustrate how the material is delivered. Next, we will examine the self-determination theory. According to Shunk, self-determination theory emphasizes that intrinsic motivation is driven by the psychological needs of competence, autonomy, and relatedness. Shukajilov et al. State that the psychological need for the competence is satisfied when students feel mastery and have opportunities to enhance their knowledge. The subjectability of the student can affect the satisfaction of their need for competence. Sakajil et al. States that students experience a feeling of autonomy when they feel like they are in control of making their own decisions for their own goals. Intrinsic and extrinsic motivation impact student satisfaction and the need for autonomy. They also found that students experience a feeling of relatedness when they feel like they belong and are connected to others. Student satisfaction for the need for relatedness can be achieved in the classroom environment. According to Ryan and Desi, teachers are identified as the most proximal influence on students' engagement and learning. The school environment can influence student motivation. The key components of a learner-centered approach, multimedia instructional design, and self-determination learning theory have all been addressed. The important part is integrating all 3 components. The following section highlights how these 3 components impact student motivation, engagement, and academic performance. In a study by Lon, the researcher examines self-directed learning skills among multimedia design students and identifies how self-determination theory interventions impact academic performance and motivation. Lon found that self-directed learning skills and self-determination theory interventions fostered a more positive attitude toward learning and that high self-expectations correlated to increased motivation. Lon found that students are aware of self-determination theory and perceive the majority of instruction to be student-centered learning, that there is a significant difference in the self-directed learning skills among years of enrollment in the program, and that regardless of years in the program, each level showed high capability and motivation and readiness. In phase 2, the researcher found that second-year students did better than the first-year experimental, and second-year experimental students outperformed the second-year control group. Schneider et al. Investigated how choice and perceived task difficulty influence student motivation and educational outcomes in a multimedia learning environment. Schneider et al. Found that task difficulty did not affect learning results, that lower task difficulty did not increase motivation, and higher perceived task difficulty led to better accuracy in the learning assessment. Additionally, the researchers found that choice led to increased retention and transfer, especially among secondary students with higher task difficulty. Schneider et al. Found that learners who think the text is difficult will believe that they are less competent and underestimate their learning success and have low motivation. However, when they are perceived as having high task difficulty, the option for choice can increase motivation and learning outcomes. The experiment consisted of 6 parts: manipulating perceived task difficulty and choice, learning websites, and interspersed questionnaires. They used multivariate and univariate analyses of variance to determine the differences between the 4 groups. Rajay and Tomaselvi observed language proficiency and self-determination theory traits among students who participated in game-based quizzes and polls with various multimedia platforms and tools. They found that game-based quizzing with formative assessments can improve learning while increasing engagement and motivation. They also found that game-based quizzes emphasize the engagement potential of multimedia platforms. Kiani and Zakim took a different angle by utilizing machine learning models to predict student motivation and academic performance within multimedia settings. They found that the machine learning model prediction accuracy improved up until 100 runs when it was capped at 99.98%. In order to produce this evidence, the researchers in previous studies carefully implemented and assessed how their learner-centered approach through multimedia, with a focus on self-determination theory, impacted student motivation, engagement, and academic performance. A teacher should first familiarize themselves with the previously mentioned key principles to implement a learner-centered approach focusing on self-determination theory and multimedia instructional design. To assess the implementation later, there should be an initial pretest to establish a baseline of the student's knowledge and a self-determination theory questionnaire to determine their perceived self-determination. In a study by Lon, the researcher began with an initial collection of quantitative data through a 3-part cross-sectional questionnaire-based survey about self-determination theory, the self-directed learning readiness scale, and motivation behavior. Snyder et al. Used questionnaires in the research literature to survey students regarding perceived task difficulty and choice, and develop some content questions to show retention and knowledge transfer. The teacher and other stakeholders or team members should establish a plan to assess whether the proposed learner-centered approach positively impacts student motivation and academic performance. Important considerations include a timeline, the tools or tests to measure student motivation and academic performance, and a measurable, realistic target to show evidence of success. Assessing the implemented learner-centered approach is essential in determining performance improvement. Students should be given a post-test, and the results should be compared to the initial pretest. Various specific tests can be used to analyze the data to assess the usefulness of the implementation. This presentation, the following examples address one sample t-test comparing pre and post-test means and standard deviations and regression analysis. Lon used a one sample t-test on survey data to gain information on self-determination theory awareness, perceptions of student-centered instructional time, self-directed learning skills, motivation, and readiness. Through multiple choice and scale questionnaires, Schneider et al. Measured prior knowledge, knowledge retention and transfer, accuracy, perceived cognitive load, intrinsic motivation, and achievement motives in a multimedia activity, and then found the mean and standard deviation. The participants were assigned to the groups low task and high task difficulty, each with a subgroup of with and without choice, and the data were calculated as the mean and standard deviation for roughly 20 questions. Rajay and Tom Selvey used a regression analysis to compare the low-stakes formative and post-test scores with a single group experimental design with an online pilot group during COVID-19 and 2 years after the pandemic. The collected data included user logs, low-stake quiz grades, polls, and post-test results during 6 weeks of a technical English class. The multimedia platforms used included Kahoot, Mentimeter, Quizzes, Plickers, Google Forms, and Moodle. Students were given 10 questions about how multimedia engaged and motivated the student, the ease of the use of the platforms, and perceived academic improvement. They analyzed a 10-question survey by calculating the mean result and the percentage of students who agreed or strongly agreed with statements about how the multimedia engaged and motivated the students, the ease of the use of the platforms, and perceived academic improvement. The researchers used a regression analysis between the scores of the low-stakes formative tests and the post-test to conclude a statistically significant correlation between improved performance and a p-value of 0.000. The researchers in the previous studies carefully implemented and assessed how their learner-centered approach through multimedia with a focus on self-determination theory impacted student motivation, engagement, and academic performance. To conclude this presentation, we will look at some of the limitations the researchers noted, share some final thoughts, and display the references that were mentioned. There are similar challenges concerning limitations in the studies in this presentation. One limitation is that educators tend to use convenient sampling and use their own students, or at least students at their school, as participants in the research study. Using our own students tends to provide relatively small sample sizes, a narrow window age group, and culturally relevant to the local area. Lon noted the study's much smaller group of second-year students because that was just who was available. Another limitation is that surveys rely on the perceptions of students. Schneider et al. Mentioned a lack of measurement of perceived autonomy and choice, competence concerning task difficulty, measurement of motivation, and evaluation of engagement. There are also limitations to the use of technology. Rajay and Thomas Selvey discuss limitations that include network stability, device incompatibility, software problems, and cost. This presentation has examined the integration of learner-centered approaches, multimedia instructional design, and self-determination theory as key components in improving student motivation, engagement, and academic performance. Suwanto et al. State that employing student-centered strategies can significantly influence students' motivation and higher-order thinking skills across diverse learning contexts. Toe and Tassir and Reina reveal that implementing multimedia instructional design, which fosters interactivity and engagement, leads to improved academic outcomes for students compared to traditional instructional methods. Furthermore, Shunk and Heinzman share that the application of self-determination theory emphasizes addressing students' psychological needs for competence, autonomy, and relatedness, which is essential for cultivating intrinsic motivation and promoting sustained academic success. The implications of these findings are significant in my professional setting. By prioritizing learner-centered approaches and integrating multimedia resources, I can contribute to a more engaging and effective educational atmosphere that aligns with students' psychological needs. I can create an engaging learning environment that increases motivation and improves academic performance. Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to your comments and questions. Please email me at selly.demarco@spark5.net. Here are the references used to make this presentation.